If My Hoe Could Talk is the 18th episode of the 5th season of Two and a Half Men. This is directed by Jon Cryer, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode chronologically and share some thoughts. I really enjoyed this. There's one quote that I absolutely loved, and I'll share that. In fact, there are a few quotes I loved, and I'll share that as we go through them. It starts off at breakfast. Jake says he has no homework. Bit suspicious. Turns out he needs to write a book report on the taming of the shrew, and he doesn't have the book. So we go to the bookstore, and while Alan and Jake are off in the Shakespeare section, Charlie's looking at self-help books, which I really like. I like the thought that Charlie is realising that if he wants to actually have a positive rest of his life and maybe settle down with somebody, he needs to maybe recalibrate his thinking. So he's looking at the books, and he meets a woman called Angie, and she recommends a book to him. Turns out she wrote the book, and Charlie says he doesn't really want to be vulnerable. How can that be a good thing? And she said, and I love this, she said, if you're not vulnerable, you can't feel anything, which I thought was pretty great. And Charlie buys the book. We're then back at the house. Turns out Jake left his book on the bus, which I assume was on purpose, but with Jake, you never know. And Alan says, we're going back to the bookstore, we're going to get the book again. This one's coming out of your allowance. And Jake said, what allowance? And Alan's face in that moment, realising he just told Jake that he probably should be giving him an allowance, I rather enjoyed quite a lot. And Charlie comes home and he's sharing all of this self-help stuff. He's really been absorbing this information, and it's really nice to see him being really passionate about this. And he goes to dinner with Angie, and he learns that she had just left college in 1972, and he's doing some kind of quick maths and realising that she's a little older than he is, and certainly older than the women he usually dates. And that in itself is not only not a problem, but also probably a very healthy thing for Charlie to be doing. But it gets a little bit strange when she starts to basically treat him like a child. She rubs a smudge off of his face. She encourages him to eat something that looks, in his words, kind of yucky. And it is a bit strange. And then he's dropping her off at home, and her 32-year-old son is there. And Charlie's not loving this, but clearly he likes Angie, and I think that it's an unusual situation for Charlie to be in. He goes back home, and all we hear is Alan screaming at Jake because he lost the book again. And Charlie explains that Angie is a little bit older, and then Jake pretends to find the book. They do find the book in the freezer, and Alan shouts through to Jake, and Jake responds, I found it, I'm reading it, which is just, I found that to be very, very funny. But the bit that I loved, I genuinely laughed out loud at this, is he does eventually sit at the table with the book, and he's reading it, and he said, all I get from this is blah, 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 apple tart. Which I absolutely love. I love Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare is, as a person, very fascinating, but a lot of Shakespeare's plays are great. That's not to say I love them all. There are some that I don't care for. But admittedly, facing Shakespeare text at that age is not the most pleasant experience. So blah, 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 apple tart is a very realistic takeaway. Angie then comes over and she tells Charlie to go and get a coat, and Charlie goes upstairs so he doesn't freeze, and while Charlie's getting his coat, Angie talks with Alan. And I realised in that moment when Angie was talking with Alan that she'd be really good for Alan. I think they'd be really good together, much more suited than she is with Charlie, but I think she's also a good thing for Charlie. And Alan, she says that chiropractors do great work, and Alan ends up sobbing on her shoulder as he unleashes all of these things, and Charlie comes downstairs and just says, so you've met my brother, or you're getting to know my brother, or something to that effect. I didn't write it down, but the situation just amused me, and I rather liked it. And then we finish in the car with Charlie and Angie, and what I particularly like about this is Angie is driving. And I like that because usually when we see the car, not always, but often Charlie is in the driving seat. And the fact that Angie is the one in the driving seat, I think is quite telling. There's something quite good about that. But in the passenger seats, in the back, are Alan and Jake. And it was quite sweet. And honestly, again, I thought Angie, Alan and Jake would make a really sweet little family. It was really lovely. And It was quite a nice moment. So I rather enjoyed this episode. I thought If My Whole Could Talk was pretty great. Personal highlights would have to be the bookstore just as a location, and Alan's face when Jake said, "What allowance?" And the whole dinner scene, it was uncomfortable in the restaurant, but I did like how it played out. Alan screaming at Jake because he lost the book. And my favourite quote, it has to be one of my favourite Two and a Half Men quotes. All I get from this all I get from this is blah 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 apple tart. Which, yeah, I'm happy. I liked it a lot. And I really like Angie as a character. And did I say she's played by Susan Blakely? I think I did. If not, I have now. And yeah, I like her. I like the episode. It's definitely a good penultimate episode to the 5th season. And of course, we'll talk about the last episode when we get there. Really looking forward to it. I'll be sorry to see the end of season 5. It's a really good season, but I know that there are some really good episodes ahead. And of course, we'll talk about those when we get there. For now, I can say If My Whole Could Talk is a really good episode of Two and a Half Men.